Princess Leora stood at the highest balcony of the royal palace of Solara, looking down at the landing platform where the human delegation was about to arrive. Her hands rested lightly on the crystal railing, but her fingers trembled just a little. She had prepared herself for this meeting for months, practicing calm expressions and polite gestures, but the thought of facing a human soldier in person made her heart race faster than ever before. She had read about humans in her history archives, stories of their stubborn courage, strange sense of honor, and unpredictable behavior. They were fascinating creatures, and somehow, they felt different from anyone she had ever met. Her mind wandered for a moment, imagining what the human would be like. Would he bow properly? Would he understand her customs, her careful manners, her words filled with centuries of diplomacy? And yet, there was a pull in her chest she did not expect, a curiosity that both thrilled and frightened her. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. "You are a princess," she reminded herself, "and a princess must always be composed." She could not allow herself to falter, not now, not in front of a human. The doors to the landing platform opened and a hush fell over the palace. Servants and guards moved quietly, their expressions respectful but anxious. Leora took a deep breath, holding it for a moment before exhaling slowly. The twin suns of her planet painted the sky in gold and purple hues, and the warm light reflected off her gown, making it shimmer like liquid silver. She looked the part of royalty, calm, elegant, untouchable, but inside her thoughts raced like wild comets. Then she saw him. Captain Marcus Kane stepped onto the platform. His uniform was simple, dark, and neat, but he carried himself with a confidence that made her stomach flutter. He walked steadily, without hesitation, his boots clicking lightly on the metal surface. He paused and looked up toward the balcony, his eyes locking with hers. Leora felt a strange heat rise to her cheeks, though she forced her face into a serene mask. He smiled slightly, a small, respectful gesture, and Leora's heart betrayed her again. Why does he have to be so human, she wondered. Every story she had heard painted humans as brave and fearless, but she did not expect to feel this strange, gentle pull toward one. She was a princess of Solara, trained to inspire awe, not to be fascinated by the presence of a single soldier, and yet she felt drawn to him as if a quiet thread had tied their worlds together. "Princess Leora," a voice called. Marcus bowed slightly, and Leora returned the gesture with perfect poise. "It is an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, Captain Kane," she said, her voice calm, but in her mind, her heart was pounding so hard she feared it might echo through the hall. She noticed how his eyes held steady on hers, curious and attentive, and something inside her shifted. She had faced generals, diplomats, even creatures from other galaxies, but this human, he was different. He had a presence that demanded attention without arrogance, a courage that seemed quiet yet undeniable. The initial greetings were formal, but every glance, every subtle movement made Leora feel both exhilarated and nervous. She reminded herself again she must stay composed. Her advisors were watching. The cameras of her world's media were capturing every motion, and centuries of expectation weighed heavily on her shoulders. She could not let herself falter, even for a heartbeat. As the human approached the palace's grand doors to join the council chamber, Leora took one last steadying breath. Her chest tightened with anticipation, and for a fleeting moment she imagined what it would be like to reach out, to touch his hand, to speak freely without ceremony or expectation. But the thought vanished almost instantly. She was a princess. She was Solara's future. Duty demanded discipline, control, and poise. Yet as Marcus walked past the balcony and into the hall, she could not deny the strange warmth spreading in her chest. Something about him, something human and honest, had unsettled her carefully constructed composure. Leora squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and whispered softly to herself, "I am a princess. I will remain strong." And with that she turned and followed him into the hall, stepping into a meeting that would challenge not just her diplomacy, but her heart in ways she had never imagined. The grand doors of the council chamber closed behind them with a soft echo. Princess Leora walked in gracefully, her gown trailing behind her, reflecting the ambient lights that glimmered from the crystal chandeliers. Captain Marcus Kane followed with careful steps, his eyes quietly scanning the room before resting on her once more. Leora felt the familiar flutter in her chest, the one that told her she was unusually aware of this human. She had faced countless beings of power and influence, yet None had made her feel so alive, so aware of every small movement around her. "Princess Leora," Marcus said again, his voice calm, steady, and respectful. "It is a great honor to meet you in person." Leora inclined her head slightly, her voice soft but composed. "Captain Kane, the honor is mine. I hope your journey to Solara was comfortable." "It was enlightening," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. There was a warmth in his voice, a simple honesty that Leora found disarming. She forced herself to focus on her role, remembering that she was here to represent her world, not to be distracted by charm or personal feeling. The formal introductions continued. Advisors from both sides spoke in careful, precise tones, discussing logistics, protocols, and the importance of trust between their worlds. Leora nodded politely, offering her attention equally to all, yet her gaze kept flicking back to Marcus. There was a steady confidence in the way he listened, the way he responded to questions, not arrogance, not haste, but a deliberate consideration that impressed her. At one point, a senior Solaran minister raised a concern about a trade agreement. Marcus leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on the table, and spoke with measured calm. "I understand your concerns, but I believe there is a solution that respects both our worlds. We just need to approach it with trust and patience." Leora's breath caught. His words were simple, yet their meaning carried weight far beyond the chamber. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the honesty and courage of a human willing to stand for what he believed in, even in the face of centuries of alien tradition. A part of her admired it. Another part of her worried how fragile her carefully maintained composure truly was. As the meeting continued, small moments occurred that unsettled her more than she expected. Marcus would glance at her for a brief second during discussions, as if silently asking if she agreed, if she understood, if she trusted him. Each look sent a quiet shiver down her spine. She reminded herself constantly she was a princess. She must remain calm, composed, untouchable. She could not let her feelings show. Yet in a quiet moment when advisors were reviewing documents, Marcus spoke softly, almost as if to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "Your world. It's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And you?" He paused, glancing at her for only a heartbeat. "You carry it with a strength I deeply respect." Leora's chest tightened. She felt a warmth spreading across her face, yet she bowed her head slightly, keeping her expression neutral. Strength, she thought. She wanted to say she had learned from centuries of leadership, from countless trials, but the words felt small. Somehow this human saw beyond titles, beyond ceremony. He saw her just as she was. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of negotiation and polite discussion, but Leora was acutely aware of every detail. Every inflection in Marcus's voice, every gesture, every patient pause, it all left an impression she could not ignore. By the time the session ended, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had held her composure, yes, but she had also faced a force unlike any she had encountered before. As they left the chamber, she caught a final glance from Marcus. There was no arrogance, no pretense, just a simple acknowledgement of shared understanding. And in that look, Leora realized something that surprised her. Humans were more than stories, more than legends. They were real, brave, and astonishingly capable of touching hearts in ways she had never imagined. For the first time, she wondered if she could remain composed, not just for the sake of duty, but in a way that allowed her to feel without fear. And with that thought lingering in her mind, she followed Marcus through the palace corridors, ready for the next stage of a meeting that would challenge her more than she had ever expected. The following day, the council chamber was alive with quiet murmurs and the subtle tension of diplomacy. Princess Leora arrived early, her steps measured, her gaze calm, but inside her heart thudded with anticipation. Today was not just a meeting, it was a test of wills. Captain Marcus Kane had requested a private session to discuss certain terms of the treaty. It was unusual, risky even, but Leora knew she could not refuse. Her advisors whispered warnings, reminding her of centuries-old customs, of the careful balance of power. She nodded politely, but she could feel the weight of her own curiosity. When Marcus entered, he carried no grand gestures, no pomp, just a calm, steady presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. Leora's stomach fluttered involuntarily. She had reminded herself countless times, a princess must remain composed. Do not let a human soldier unsettle you. Yet every time his eyes met hers, she felt a quiet pull, a force she could not explain. "Princess," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet like this. I know it may feel unusual." "Unusual, yes," Leora admitted, her voice even but her pulse quickening. "But sometimes diplomacy requires a private understanding beyond the eyes of others." She gestured to the chairs in the center of the room. "Please sit." They sat facing each other, the polished floor reflecting their images like a still pond. For a long moment they spoke little, measuring each other in silence. Then Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on his knees. "The terms suggested by your council, they are fair in theory," he began, "but they may not protect your people fully. And I cannot, in good conscience, let that happen." Leora's brow furrowed slightly. Her advisors had assured her the terms were unbreakable, advantageous, and safe. Yet, as she listened to Marcus explain, logically and respectfully, how adjustments could strengthen the treaty, she realized the truth. He was not here to challenge her authority. He was here to protect life, both human and alien. "You speak with conviction," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Do you truly believe these changes are necessary?" "I do," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I would not ask if I did not believe it would save lives. Yours, mine, all of us." His gaze held hers, steady and honest, and Leora felt her chest tighten. She had faced countless leaders, warriors, and strategists, but none had ever looked at her with such unwavering sincerity. It was as if he could see the weight she carried, the expectations, the centuries of tradition, and yet he respected her entirely. The discussion grew intense. Advisors from both sides argued, presented data, and referenced histories, but Leora and Marcus remained focused, quietly matching each other in wit and reasoning. Every word Marcus spoke tested her patience, her discipline, and, surprisingly, her heart. She had learned to remain unshakable, untouchable, yet she found herself listening with more than duty. She was listening with care. She was listening with curiosity, admiration, and even a quiet respect she could not fully admit. At one point, frustration surged through her. "Captain, you underestimate the traditions of Solara," she exclaimed softly, though her voice carried the weight of her station. "You cannot change centuries of rules simply with human logic." Marcus met her gaze calmly. "I am not trying to change your traditions," he said earnestly. "I am asking you to see what I see. Strength is not in following rules blindly. Strength is in protecting what matters most, even if it means questioning the old ways." The words struck her harder than she expected. Strength, protection, courage. All things she had been taught to value. Yet hearing them spoken with such simple honesty made her feel vulnerable. She wanted to argue, to assert her authority. But another part of her, the part Marcus had quietly awakened, listened, understood, and trembled. By the end of the session, neither had fully conceded, yet an unspoken understanding had formed. Leora realized she could respect his perspective without losing herself, and Marcus realized she was more formidable than any warrior he had ever faced. For the first time, they were not just princess and soldier. They were two beings from different worlds, meeting with honesty, courage, and a strange, growing connection that neither could ignore. When they finally rose, Leora's chest was tight, her hands clasped at her sides. She had remained composed, yes, but her mind and heart had been tested in ways she had never anticipated. And as Marcus gave a quiet nod, acknowledging the unspoken bond between them, she realized that this human had changed her understanding of strength, courage, and trust forever. The sun was dipping low behind Solara's distant mountains, casting the sky in a warm orange glow. Princess Leora walked alone through the palace gardens, her gown brushing softly against the marble pathways. She needed this moment of solitude. The day had been exhausting, filled with negotiation, subtle arguments, and the quiet, steady presence of Captain Marcus Kane. She had kept her composure in the council chamber, as a princess must, but now in the calm of the garden, she allowed herself to feel. Her chest felt heavy with emotions she could not fully name, admiration, curiosity, even a strange warmth that made her stomach flutter. It was confusing and disarming. She had always prided herself on discipline, on remaining untouchable in front of others. Yet this human soldier had made her realize how fragile that control truly was. She shook her head, trying to banish the feelings. "I am a princess. I must not." A soft rustle of footsteps made her pause. She turned to see Marcus walking slowly toward her, his uniform catching the last rays of the sun. He did not approach with any urgency or arrogance, just a quiet respect that made her chest tighten in ways she did not expect. "Princess," he said gently, his voice breaking the stillness of the garden. "I hope I am not intruding." "You're not," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. Her hands fidgeted at the edge of her gown, a small betrayal of the calm she had worked so hard to maintain. "I needed a moment to myself." Marcus nodded, his eyes soft but attentive. He stood a few feet away, giving her space, yet his presence filled the garden like a quiet force. "I understand," he said simply. "Sometimes even leaders need time away from the world to think clearly." Leora swallowed hard. He understands. A human understands. That thought alone was enough to make her knees feel weaker than she wanted to admit. She wanted to speak, to tell him how unnervingly he had affected her, how his calm honesty had cut through layers of duty and tradition she had wrapped around herself. But words failed her. A princess did not confess vulnerability so openly, even to a soldier from another world. Instead, she walked a few steps closer to the marble railing overlooking the palace courtyard. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment she let herself breathe, let herself feel. Marcus did not speak, did not intrude. He simply walked beside her, sharing the silence. That quiet companionship, she realized, was more comforting than any words could ever be. I do not understand why humans are so different," she murmured finally, almost to herself. "You face danger, uncertainty, and yet you are not afraid to speak, to question, to stand alone if necessary." Marcus looked at her then, a faint smile on his lips. "We are afraid," he said. "Every human is, but we do what must be done anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting even when you feel it. I see it in you too, Princess. In every decision, every word you speak. You are brave even if you do not always believe it." Her chest tightened again. His words were simple, almost unremarkable on the surface, but they carried a weight she could not ignore. He saw her, really saw her, not just as a princess, not just as a figurehead, but as someone striving, struggling, and carrying responsibilities no one else could fully understand. For the first time in months, Leora allowed herself to lean slightly on the railing, her guard dropping just a little. She did not speak. She simply let the silence between them stretch, filled with understanding and a strange, quiet intimacy. Marcus did not move closer, did not reach out, yet somehow his presence alone was enough to steady her heart and calm the storm of emotions swirling within. After a long moment, she turned her gaze to the horizon. "Perhaps strength is more than what I thought," she said softly. "Perhaps it is not only about control, but about knowing when to face what scares us. And still move forward." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. And it seems you understand that better than most." The sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the garden in the soft glow of twilight. Leora knew that when they returned to their roles, she would have to regain composure, mask her feelings, and fulfill her duties as a princess. But in this quiet, fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel, and in doing so, she realized that perhaps this human soldier had shown her a different kind of courage. One that was quiet, simple, and yet infinitely powerful. The following morning, the palace was alive with the hum of preparation. Today, Princess Leora and Captain Marcus Kane were to finalize the treaty that would shape the future of both their worlds. Leora walked through the corridors with practiced grace, yet her heart felt heavier than usual. It was not the weight of duty alone. There was something unspoken between her and the human soldier that made every step more charged, more urgent, and more fragile. When Marcus entered the room, he gave a polite nod, but his eyes lingered on her just a little longer than protocol required. Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and reminded herself of the centuries of tradition she carried. She was a princess. She must remain composed. Yet the simple warmth of his gaze unsettled her in a way she could not entirely control. The negotiations began formally, advisors speaking in measured tones, detailing the final terms. Yet in the quiet moments between discussions, their eyes met, and Leora found herself noticing things she had never allowed herself to see before. The small creases at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the way his hands rested calmly on the table, the quiet confidence that required no words. These things were magnetic, drawing her attention even when she tried to focus elsewhere. At one point, A minor dispute arose regarding territorial boundaries. Leora's advisors whispered urgently, their voices low but insistent, yet Marcus remained calm. "Princess," he said gently, "I know your counsel is cautious, but sometimes caution can prevent progress. We must consider what is best for everyone, not just what has been done before." Her chest tightened. He was right, of course, but she could not simply agree without careful consideration. And yet the way he spoke, the sincerity in his voice, the unwavering steadiness of his eyes, made it almost impossible to argue harshly. She found herself pausing, reflecting, and in that pause she realized something new. Marcus was not trying to undermine her. He was trying to stand beside her, not in opposition but in collaboration. For the first time, Leora felt a real connection with another being. It was not just admiration or curiosity anymore. It was understanding. In the calm honesty of this human soldier, she recognized a courage that mirrored her own, a strength that respected hers instead of challenging it. And she realized with a thrill she could hardly name that perhaps they were not so different after all. As the final terms were agreed upon, they shook hands. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried far more weight than either of them could have imagined. Leora felt a warmth in her palm, a quiet pulse of understanding, as if the action itself bridged the vast distance between their worlds. She looked into his eyes and saw more than a soldier. She saw integrity, honor, and a kind of bravery that made her heart ache in the best way possible. When the ceremony ended and the delegation began to leave, Marcus lingered. "Princess Leora," he said softly, "I hope that after today this is not our last meeting. I hope we can continue to learn from each other, not just as allies, but as friends." Leora's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to speak, to tell him that he had already changed her, that his presence had made her feel more alive than she had in decades. But her lips parted only slightly and she managed a quiet, "I hope so, Captain Kane. Your world, and your courage, have left a mark I will not forget." As he departed, she watched his figure retreat into the distance, feeling a mix of longing and awe. She had maintained her composure, yes, but she had also allowed herself to recognize a connection she could not deny. Humans were fragile in many ways, yes, but they carried a strength of heart and mind that even centuries of tradition could not teach. Leora turned back toward the palace, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once more. But now there was a lightness too. A quiet hope that even across the expanse of space, bridges could be built, bonds could be formed, and hearts could be touched in ways she had never thought possible. And somewhere in the depths of her being, she knew that the human soldier had shown her a new kind of strength, one that was gentle, honest, and profoundly human. The palace was quiet that evening, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Princess Leora sat alone in her private chamber, staring at the holographic display of the treaty they had finalized earlier. Everything was in place. Agreements signed, alliances secured, and both worlds set on a path toward peace. On paper, the mission had been a success, but her heart was far from settled. She could not stop thinking about Marcus. His calm eyes, the sincerity in his voice, the courage that seemed effortless yet profound, it haunted her. Every detail replayed in her mind like a gentle echo she could not silence. She had spent centuries learning to control her emotions, to mask her thoughts, to remain untouchable, but this human soldier had broken through every layer she had built around herself. Her chest tightened as she recalled the quiet moments in the garden, the way he had stood near her without overstepping, the way he had spoken about courage and fear, about doing what must be done despite uncertainty. Those words had lingered far longer than any protocol, any speech, any lesson in leadership. He had seen her, not just the princess, not just the symbol of Solara, but the person beneath the titles. And she had felt seen in a way that left her both vulnerable and strangely exhilarated. A soft knock on the door startled her. "Enter," she called, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Marcus stepped inside, carrying nothing but a quiet determination. He paused at the threshold, giving her a respectful bow. "Princess Leora," he said softly, "I did not mean to intrude. I just could not leave without speaking to you once more." Leora's pulse quickened. She tried to steady herself, reminding her heart that she was a princess, that she could not lose control. "Captain Kane," she said, her voice composed but gentle. "You may speak." He approached slowly, eyes never leaving hers. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for trusting me, for listening, for being willing to consider what I had to say. You showed strength today more than any human or alien I have ever met." Her throat tightened. Strength. That word again. It carried so many meanings, yet it felt heavier now, weighted with emotion and admiration. She wanted to tell him that he had shown her strength too, the strength to see beyond duty, to embrace connection, to face something larger than herself without fear. But the words felt fragile, almost dangerous, like they could shatter if spoken aloud. "I thank you," she whispered instead, keeping her gaze steady. "Your presence has reminded me that strength is not just about control or command. Sometimes it is about courage of the heart and seeing the world through another's eyes." Marcus smiled, a quiet, heartfelt expression. "I feel the same, Princess. Our worlds are so different, but I think perhaps our hearts are not so far apart." The room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in a space where titles and duties had no weight. Leora realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that she had begun to care for him, not just as an ally, not just as a soldier, but as someone who had awakened feelings she had never allowed herself to explore. She looked down for a moment, gathering courage. "Captain Kane?" He raised a hand, gently stopping her. "Shh," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything now. I understand. More than you know." And in that quiet moment, Princess Leora felt a profound clarity. She had always believed that to be strong, she must remain untouchable, unshaken, unfeeling. But perhaps real strength lay in allowing oneself to feel, to trust and to connect, even when it was terrifying. The twilight deepened, and the soft glow of the room wrapped around them like a fragile promise. Leora knew that when the world called her back, she would resume her duties, her poise, her role as a princess. But tonight she allowed herself to feel the warmth, the admiration, the quiet, undeniable pull toward a human soldier who had shown her a different kind of courage, a different kind of strength, and for the first time in her life, she felt that strength within herself, not from tradition, not from power, but from something far more human, the courage to open her heart. The day of departure arrived sooner than Princess Leora had imagined. The human delegation was preparing to leave Solara, and the grand landing platform hummed with activity. Leora stood at the balcony overlooking the platform, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, trying to steady the storm of emotions in her chest. She had rehearsed countless polite phrases, countless gestures of royal composure, but none of them could prepare her for the ache she felt at the thought of Captain Marcus Kane leaving her world. He appeared on the platform, his movements measured, his expression calm. Yet when his eyes met hers, a spark of something unspoken passed between them. A quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had forged over days of negotiation, conversation, and shared understanding. Leora felt her chest tighten. She reminded herself that she was a princess, that her duty came first. Yet the human soldier had shown her something far more profound than protocol or ceremony. He had shown her courage, trust, and the strength of connection. "Princess Leora," Marcus said softly as he approached, keeping his voice low against the murmurs of the delegation. "It has been an honor, not just for the mission, but for me personally." Leora's throat felt dry. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything she felt, the admiration, the respect, the quiet warmth that had grown in her chest, but the words seemed too fragile, too human, too impossible for a princess to say aloud. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his with honesty that needed no words. "I hope," Marcus continued, "that this is not the last time our paths cross. I hope that one day we can meet again, not as representatives of our worlds, but as friends." A shiver ran through her. She wanted more than friendship. She wanted to tell him that he had changed her, that his presence had awakened a courage she had never known, a heart she had kept locked behind centuries of duty. Yet she forced herself to remain composed. Duty and tradition demanded restraint. Still, she allowed herself a small, sincere smile. "I hope so, Captain Kane," she said softly. "Your world, and your courage, will not be forgotten by me." He stepped closer, bowing slightly before straightening. The engines of the human transport began to hum, signaling that it was time to depart. Marcus looked at her one final time, and in that brief, silent moment, Leora felt the weight of the connection they had formed. Across space, across worlds, a bond had been built, a bond not dictated by power or protocol, but by courage, understanding, and the bravery to see and respect each other fully. As the transport lifted into the sky, the twin suns reflecting off its hull, Leora felt a strange mixture of loss and hope. She had remained composed, yes, but inside she was changed. The human soldier had shown her that strength was not only in command or tradition, but in heart, in honesty, and in the willingness to trust despite uncertainty. She turned back toward the palace, feeling both the weight of her crown and the lightness of newfound understanding. Solara awaited her, her people awaited her, but she carried something precious with her now. The memory of courage, kindness, and connection. A reminder that even across galaxies, hearts could meet, respect could flourish, and humans could inspire aliens to see the world in a new light. Standing in the quiet of her balcony, she whispered to herself, almost as if speaking to Marcus across the stars, "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be brave, not just as a princess, but as someone who can feel, who can trust, and who can hope." The sun set behind the mountains, leaving a sky painted with colors of gold and violet. Princess Leora turned inward, feeling alive in a way she had never allowed herself to feel before. The journey of diplomacy was over, but the journey of the heart had just begun. Somewhere out there, Captain Marcus Kane carried a piece of her world, and she carried a piece of his courage, and in that quiet, fragile connection, Leora knew that strength, true strength, was not only in ruling a kingdom, but in opening one's heart, and she had finally learned how to do both.